To the curious, the seekers, and also the experts, welcome. You are listening to the Poli-Psych podcast, in which we discuss political personalities, media personalities, and other notables in terms of the MBTI and the Enneagram. So today we are going to be discussing Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her remarkable ability to manage a harsh room. And with us is Ken, our MBTI specialist. Hello, Ken.
Hello, Cindy.
And also with us is Don, our Enneagram specialist. Hello and welcome, Don.
Hello. Glad to be here.
So I think we're going to begin by looking at some clips. Is that what we'd like to do?
Sure. It's an old story. We've had time to digest it. And actually, we don't hear very much about it. The Kavanaugh nomination did pass through. He was sort of a moderate as far as judicial history goes, and was actually a hot button issue. I think he was technically pro-choice based on statute or based on prior cultural leanings as far as the law went. He didn't want to reverse the process of cultural adjustment to a law. So what makes this case ironic is that it was fought so vociferously, ending on both sides really with a very high profile standoff, which we'll lead into here with this press conference, which is kind of an icon of the conflict itself.
Lastly, on the night President Trump nominated Judge Brett Kavanaugh, Senator Schumer declared the Democrats would oppose this nomination with everything they had. Before a single document was produced, a single meeting with the senator, or a hearing was ever scheduled, Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats telegraphed a strategy to throw the kitchen sink at the judge with no regard for the process, decency, or standards. They're not opposed to Judge Kavanaugh's judicial views. They're literally trying to undercut the voice of the American people when they elected Donald Trump. They have questioned his legitimacy and casually tossed around vicious accusations of perjury, all false and baseless, but now they've sunk lower as they spring these 11th hour accusations and a full-scale assault on Judge Kavanaugh's integrity. This is a coordinated smear campaign. No evidence, no independent corroboration, just smears. Here are just a few of the examples. Chuck Schumer said, and I quote, "There's no presumption of innocence or guilt." Chris Coons, who sits on the committee, said Kavanaugh, and I quote, "now bears the burden of disproving these allegations rather than Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez." Mazie Hirono, who also sits on the committee, said that Judge Kavanaugh does not deserve the presumption of innocence because of his judicial views. One thing is clear, Democrats want to block Kavanaugh and hold the seat open until the 2020 election. This is about politics, and this is about power, pure and simple. And they've destroyed Judge Kavanaugh's reputation, undermined Dr. Ford's privacy, and tried to upend our traditions of innocence until proven guilty in the process. It's a complete and total disgrace. We will receive and submit the FBI's supplemental background investigation on his nomination to the Senate. As Leader McConnell said, Judge Kavanaugh deserves a prompt vote, and we expect him to get one. And with that, I will take your questions. John.
Sarah, the three people who are most important in this whole process are Senators Murkowski, Collins, and Flake. This morning, two of those senators, Flake and Collins, were extremely upset about how the president described Christine Blasey Ford at that rally in Mississippi. Knowing how sensitive this issue is and how important it would be if the FBI investigation shows no other compelling evidence to keep Judge Kavanaugh from the court, that these people need to be comfortable with voting for him. Why did the president say what he did last night in the way that he said it?
The president was stating the facts, and frankly, facts that were included in Special Prosecutor Rachel Mitchell's report. He was stating facts that were given during Dr. Ford's testimony, and the Senate has to make a decision based on those facts and whether or not they see Judge Kavanaugh to be qualified to hold the position on the Supreme Court. Every single word Judge Kavanaugh has said has been picked apart. Every single word, second by second, of his testimony has been picked apart. Yet if anybody says anything about the accusations that have been thrown against them, that's totally off limits and outrageous. This entire process has been a disgrace, and the only reason that it's been that way is because Senate Democrats Democrats didn't do this the way that it should have been done, and they circumvented the entire system. And frankly, they've undermined our entire judicial branch by the way that they've acted and the inappropriateness of which they've conducted themselves.
Pointing out
Sorry, go ahead.
Pointing out inconsistencies in testimony is one thing, but the tone with which the president did it last night clearly had an effect on two key swing votes for his nomination. Is the president concerned that he may have put those votes in danger by doing what he did last night?
I don't think so. The president's very confident in his nominee, as he stated time and time again, and we expect the Senate to vote, and we hope they do that soon. See.
So that's our clip. And I'm always a little in awe of how well she handles the people who come at her.
Yeah, I noticed that the questions that both asked by that one person were ending with pretty simple yes or no answers. Or was the president, is he doubting himself? Of course, he's going to say no.
I think the process of a binary question is very manipulative. Most of the time, you can ask a nuanced question, and I've seen reporters do this frequently, is they'll try to force it into a binary answer. And the smart way to respond to that is to answer the question, just to ignore the binary and just answer it the way they normally would. And if they're challenged, tell the reporter, you can ask me whatever you want, but I can answer it in any manner I choose. The interesting thing, Cindy, could we have that diagram of the MBTI that I had sent over? And just to look at the interesting content, we'll be looking at the content a little bit more today rather than the person. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders comes out with a very concrete, sense-oriented perceiving. We'll look in the lower left corner of the MBTI functions. These are the perceiving functions. The sensing function and the intuition function. Sensing is a little more concrete, dealing with the five senses, what actually happened. We're at the event horizon and we're behind it a little bit. Intuition, you'll see this come up more with the reporters, where they're linking in relationships between ideas that may be separated in time and content, but trying to find a common link. And what Sarah does quite effectively several times to counter this approach, she'll have a sensing and then linked with thinking, linking that with logic, rules, and that sort of thing. And then she'll finish it off with a value judgment, the feeling. So we sort of go from the S to the T to the F, ending where the reporters wanted to go with a values-oriented assessment. And usually the values-oriented assessment will be an adjective or a mental state of either honesty, just something that's a little more nebulous as far as a value that might transcend the actual strategic hard edge of the thinking. The reporter, on the other hand, comes right back out with immediately a feeling-oriented attack on President Trump's comments in a rally that I think Don, did that, or Cindy, did that occur the night before? I think it was another large-scale MAGA rally somewhere where he commented on the case.
I believe it was the night before, but I think somebody referenced that in this video, but I'm not absolutely certain. When you referred to how Sarah moves from one function to the next, how much of that do you think is intentional? Do you think she's aware of that at all? Do you think she has trained herself to do that? Or do you think it just is how she naturally communicates?
I think you have to look at the context. We have one person facing a room full of attackers, and it's really a tough position to be in. So I think she does strategize. The reason she's unusually good for this position is that she is using the thinking function to strategize or push back, and she will generally cling to the familiar functioning of the sensing thinking, clinging to solid objects and avoiding value judgments until the very end of the train. So her value judgment does come, but it always comes right before a long setup of sensing thinking. But this is the essence of the dispute running in the chat. You can see the chat running alongside the video. The two sides are seeing two movies on one screen. So the intuitive is already looking at Donald Trump as a pejorative figure, looking at Christine Blasey Ford as the victim, which probably is true. It doesn't necessarily apply to Kavanaugh, but there's pretty obvious that there probably was something that happened to Christine Blasey Ford at some point. Whether or not it was Kavanaugh has pretty much been, when the FBI looked into it, they didn't find any credibility in certain aspects of the case. So nevertheless, the dispute rolls on and the two sides completely talk past each other.
Yeah, from an Enneagram perspective, Ken, I'm really seeing the same things that you are, and just in kind of a little different mode. If we could put the Enneagram on the screen, I'll talk with a picture there about what I'm seeing. And I'm definitely seeing that she is operating from her head, and I'm thinking, because she's quick on her feet, 7. Now, I know we had talked in the past, so you can see the 5, 6, 7 is the mind triad, and she appears to be operating somewhere in there. We discussed on another video, Cindy and I did, the possibility of Sarah being a 6. And one of the things that I noticed in this video, and I was watching for it because with the possibility of her being a 6, normally in 6s, when they're in a room full of a lot of people with a lot of things to scan for, you'll see a lot of eye darting to and fro. You'll see them scanning the room. Sarah doesn't do that. Her gaze is almost always fixed on one or two people at a time. So you do get the sense that she's in command of the room. She's definitely comfortable being extroverted. For that reason, I would say she's not operating out of 5. She's not a 5 at her core. And she could very well be a 7 with an 8 wing, or an 8 with a 7 wing. Now, the 8 aspect of her does give that commanding presence, that person who's in charge. She holds the room very confidently. There's no doubt that she's the one in charge, which means that she definitely has some 8 ability there to be the boss, to be the one in charge. And the quickness on the feet is a 7. So I'm seeing somebody that's operating there in the 7 and 8 range, and which one's predominant, it's not real clear to me which, but those are all head-centered things, except the 8, of course, is operating into the will, the imposing of the will, I'm the one in charge. But that also gives a connection, in a sense, to gut feelings. So she's able to operate in that sense, that she knows what people feel in their guts in a way similar to a 9 would, that they're able to be empathetic, to connect with the feelings of others. So you see that coming out from her when she's moving to the last part of her answer, as Ken just described, and that's the way I see it in Enneagram terms.
I think we definitely have a very strong extroverted sensing function. You just simply wouldn't have time for an introverted function to render in a format of this type. And that's shared with President Trump, also a very strong extroverted sensing function.
Yeah, and again, that's the reason I would say she's not a 5, because the 5 would be fast on their feet, but not as expressive, wouldn't have the ability to communicate to a group so quickly as she does.
And that's one advantage that the press does have. The attention is not constantly focused on the individual asking the next question, so they have plenty of time to use intuition to bring in unrelated elements. But Sarah still can land a punch or two here. It's a fairly even match. It's really a fascinating exchange in psychological terms, of almost like a chess game would play out. And the maneuvering that goes on in sort of in linguistic form through this, at least this construct, the MBTI works pretty well here, but the Enneagram as well. It's fascinating.
Aisha, go ahead.
Thank you. So President Trump talked a lot yesterday about this issue of being concerned about men being guilty before being thought guilty before proven innocent, and this idea of due process. But in the past, with the Central Park 5, he put out an ad basically calling for the death penalty before they had been found convicted, and even after they were exonerated, he still basically said that they may be guilty. And even as president, he has talked about, presided over rallies where people say lock her up, talking about Hillary Clinton. So I guess, is there a disconnect between when the president is interested in due process for some, but not for others?
Not at all. The president actually encouraged the Senate to hear Dr. Ford's testimony in the same way he encouraged them to hear Judge Kavanaugh's. He is simply stating the fact that we are a country of law and order. We are a country that still believes that you're innocent until proven guilty, and we want to see that process go through in its entirety, and it should be on a fair playing field. That's simply the only point he's making.
Guilty. He said the Central Park Five was guilty.
Yes.
And does he feel that now?
I'd have to look back at the specific comments. Dave.
But that's the real question. In the midst of this, the president has taken this moment.
Dave, go ahead.
The president has taken this moment to say that he's been affected personally by all of these allegations, and he's picking and choosing, just as the question was. He said that the Central Park Five was guilty, and that he has made Bill Clinton guilty. Has he decided to change his mind on the Central Park Five as they have been exonerated?
It's interesting that you bring up Bill Clinton. Nobody wants to hear those accusers' voices be heard, but you're certainly happy to hear all the others. Dave, go ahead.
The president had them at the debate.
I've addressed this. I don't have anything else to add.
That was, it was quite interesting. It was well played by the reporter, and again, we see a wide array of old cases being brought up, and this is like Fisher versus Spassky on this clip, and it's a very tough question. She's bringing in very unexpected occurrences from years ago that intuitively she's, at least in her opinion, and the opinion probably of the audience at this point who's tuning into this major network, that these things have to be linked, because intuitively the intuitive thinker would know that they're sort of already guilty, and then we're just looking at the sense data to prove that pretext. But Sarah bounces back with a really serious retort, and she does hold it up. She keeps it back until she's pestered, I think about the third time. She finally brings in her own, after restating the rules orientation, counters with the Clinton retort regarding the witnesses against Bill Clinton. There were 3 or 4 fairly strong witnesses, and it was a really interesting move for her to do that, and shows that she is definitely cut out for this job.
And it was kind of fortuitous for her that Bill Clinton was mentioned. I mean, that provided a tremendous segue for her.
So she didn't have to bring it up out of the blue, which would have looked bad if she had done it. But the reporter mentioned the name, so it's fair ground. The thing that interested me I found myself thinking about, okay, this woman is working as with a 3 as her boss, and the 3 can tend to look loosey-goosey all over the place, as Trump does, or at least often is portrayed by the media, that wants to make him look like he's not grounded in anything except his whim of the moment. And what Sarah does is emphasize that what we are doing is grounded in the rule of law. So it's her responsibility to establish some concreteness to a man who's perceived as being mercurial, or kind of floating with the wind, whichever way it goes. And she does that very well. She has an anchoring presence, and I'm leaning more towards thinking that she might be an 8, because that grounding effect would be something that would come out of an 8 Enneagram that wouldn't come out of a 7. So now I'm thinking more in terms of Sarah as a 8-wing 7.
I can see that. When I definitely noticed her physical presence in kind of squaring her shoulders, and because an 8 is a will type, the squaring of the shoulders and the physical presence of, like, you aren't going to move me from this place.
And even how she doesn't make eye contact at first when she calls on somebody. She's looking down at her notes and is not directly confronting the person. It's like she doesn't want to give them any of her energy. She doesn't want to focus attention on them. It's almost a way of sucking energy out of the response before it's even completed. I mean, the question before it's even completed, before the response has even begun. It's another thing I noticed there.
Well, the hard edge of the strategic thinker can come through, and this would be, again, that train of functioning between sensing, thinking. But usually in this context, the extroverted thinking function would express itself as a winning strategy or a retort that just silences the opposition. And notice that it's delivered without a really strong emotional component, which is kind of the nature of logic. I mean, it's pretty hard to get excited about 2 + 2 = 4. So it's definitely, to me, it would be a reflection of the thinking versus feeling dichotomy. But likability and politics and all these things come in more on the feeling area. And this is why I think they started to bring the gender reversal concept, which I think comes up in the third portion of this as well. It began to introduce the possibility of electoral problems if Christine Blasey Ford was reacted to in an insensitive manner, where the mannerism becomes more important than the content. And this actually is a legitimate influencing strategy. It's used all the time. Most elections are based on popularity, which is completely dependent upon the feeling function. And it's something that's very hard for conservatives to get used to, that the feeling function is a rational function, and it's based on values, whatever they happen to be, whether it's sensitivity or values can vary endlessly. So you can have no agreement on the values, but once they're shared and the audience who tunes into this gets confirmation for their own shared values, and with a hive mentality or the group harmony is sharing this value as well. This is really the essence of political influencing, and they're bringing this in rather than a sensing, thinking, rules-based. We'll see the reporters shaving off the opposite side and going from, on the diagram, the intuition, bringing in unrelated items that aren't related to this case, and then moving straight into the feeling function to create for the viewer the intended effect, which is emotional enmeshment in the television experience. The sense data is already there. You're watching television. So 43.4% of the US population operates along that bottom chain, mostly the sensing, feeling chain. And that really is kind of what happens when you're watching television. You're sitting there watching sense data, and then the thinking is being done on the television and the intuition is being done by the producer, but the sensing feeling is kind of what you're receiving, and you're receiving a characterization based on values that most of the time are shared values, so that you stick around for the commercial that comes right after it. And that seems to be working in this reporter's haven of focus on this one person standing up to it, attempting to at least.
And if we go back to the Enneagram chart, I had a thought there about Sarah as an 8, and and what I see her doing in the beginning part of the question is perhaps she's going to 5 and in the stress of a question. And some Enneagram people think that the security and stress points would be primarily operating over a longer period of time. But I hold to the theory that they can happen in a micro amount of time too. So when an 8 experiences some stress, they move to 5 and they work through that stress with their mental abilities and focus. And I see that Sarah is actually doing that when she's looking down at the question. She's actually focusing on, in an auditory sense, on the question, but looking down. And so she's not letting herself get distracted, but in a very 5-ish way, she's actually digesting the question mentally. And then she comes out as an 8 with her answer, operating from a gut sense, but moving from 5 into the gut realm with the logic all composed from the 5, but coming out with a gut feeling presentation. And so I think that's a one way to look at what she's doing.
So we have our third clip, and Ken, do you want to introduce it at all?
Well, it rolls on. We're going to start to see the repetition that we did see with the Charlottesville press conference at the Trump Tower, where repeatedly the same question will be asked, and it could be an effort to trip up the presenter, or Sarah in this case, and it doesn't work. But we'll see how it goes.
Jim?
I want to go back to this. I mean, it was pretty obvious that the president was mocking Christine Blasey Ford last night. He said, how did you get home? I don't remember. How did you get there? I don't remember. Where is this place? I don't remember. He seemed to be, to the delight of the crowd there in Mississippi, mocking her repeatedly. Isn't there something wrong with the President of the United States mocking somebody who says she was sexually assaulted?
It seemed to me that he was stating facts that Dr. Ford herself laid out in her testimony. Once again, every single word that Judge Kavanaugh has said has been looked at, examined, picked apart by most of you in this room, but no one is looking at whether or not the accusations made are corroborated, whether or not there's evidence to support them. Every person that she named has come out and said either they didn't recall it or it didn't happen or they weren't there. Every single bit of evidence and facts that we've seen in this moment have supported Judge Kavanaugh's case, and the president simply pointed out the facts of the matter, and that is what the Senate will have to use to determine whether or not they vote to support him or not.
Are you saying Judge Kavanaugh is the victim in all this?
I think both Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh are victims at the hands of the Democrats. I think it is absolutely disgraceful what they've done and exploited this process. They exploited Dr. Ford. They're exploiting all of the women that have come out to make any type of accusation. This isn't the process that should have been done. And certainly everybody deserves to be heard, but that includes Judge Kavanaugh, and that should be part of this process, and the facts have to be looked at, and I think you have to look at the prosecutor's memo. Those are where you see all of those facts laid out, and I think she makes a very compelling case. John, go ahead.
You don't have any problem defending the
I don't have any problem stating facts, no. John.
Thank you, Sarah. Just 5
I know
years
that's
ago.
something you probably do have a problem with, but I don't.
Actually, Sarah, we do state the facts, and I think there have been many occasions when you don't state the facts, if I may respond.
John, go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. Just 5 days ago on Friday, the president, when asked about Dr. Ford's testimony before the Senate, said that she was a very credible witness, and we saw a different tone, different substance last night in those remarks to that campaign rally audience in Mississippi. Why the change in tone? And does the president still believe what he said on Friday, that she was a very credible witness?
I've addressed this a number of times. The president also said she had a very compelling story, and nobody disagrees with that. Hold on. And nobody disagrees with that, but the president simply stating the facts that she laid out in her own testimony and that the prosecutor laid out in her memo. At the end of the day, the Senate has to make a decision on where they stand. Take one last
point about whether he believes she's still credible. Does the president still believe that Dr. Ford's testimony was credible when she testified under oath?
The president believes that Judge Kavanaugh should be confirmed. He has a lot of confidence in him, and he'd like to see a vote.
It's kind of fun to watch the comments go by here on the YouTube page.
Yeah, I noticed that earlier, and I think it belies the truth that we'll never have agreement in any population, any group. The differences are really there, I think, as a sort of a cultural coping mechanism to, engender this sort of conflict that always is able to adapt to changing situations depending on what they are. So the case of us ever, as a country, agreeing on the same candidate obviously would be split almost always. Even 70-30 is considered a landslide.
Yeah, I want to say something about Jim Acosta's question that, isn't there something wrong with, a president that's mocking somebody that has claimed to be sexually assaulted? And Sarah says, no, he's just, president is stating the facts. And yes, that's true. She's doing her job of obviously defending the president. And, but there's a presumption there in Jim Acosta's question, and that if somebody is making an accusation, you have to take that seriously. It's almost as if the accusation itself is above reproach. And Sarah doesn't go as far in her response, in my opinion, as I would as a 5, as the logic of my mind goes. I would actually have said something along the lines of, well, if the evidence, if the story is not factual, then isn't it reasonable to mock it, to deprive it of the presumption of truth when it may not be truthful? That's what's going through my mind. So I think actually, if Sarah is an 8 going to 5 in her analysis, that she is actually dialing it back in order to not be too forceful in her logic against the reporters there.
Yeah, I think the electoral impact of this becomes a prime consideration, and I don't think this is probably why you had the senators waffling. They weren't waffling about the truth. They were waffling about the potential impact that this might have on their constituents. Again, the statistic of feelers in the population total across the board is 60% to 40%, and that would mean that strategy is not as compelling. And the typical someone who leads with the feeling function, it doesn't mean there's illogical behavior necessarily, but feelings will follow the facts in our case, but facts sometimes follow feelings in a majority of the population. So if the impact of that would be if someone comes across as rude or socially pejorative in some sense, then whatever they say after that will not have as much credibility.
Yeah, and another dynamic happening there, and that whole awareness that a lot of people are moved by their feelings, is that people that are good at marketing are very aware of this, of course, and it's that perception is reality. And what happens in that dynamic, and especially when people are playing to that dynamic, is you tend to cut the leading edge off of leadership. In other words, somebody is afraid to move into the area of being bold with an idea that might be unpopular. So you get people that are hemmed in by the popular opinion of the day rather than expanding the limits of what the public would actually consider as valid. So a good leader actually does that. He pushes and takes things in a direction that people will be uncomfortable with in the beginning, but they adjust to it after a while. And I think we're talking more about Trump's leadership style, and Sarah is backing him up. But it's interesting to see how even somebody like Sarah, who I'm more and more sure is a pretty bold 8, she dials back her attack so as to help people come along.
Yeah, and I think the impact also, we'd look at the sort of how the press is set up psychologically as well. The intuitive thinker or intuitive feeler portion of the population is actually a small portion of the population, the intuitive feeler being about 16.5, but generally do predominate in academia and in the media. So what we end up seeing on television is the product of many times the intuitive feeler. They would be the more creative, able to sort of create a mood. These are things that are really good, that comprise good entertainment. And the feeling function is almost 100% of likability, lovability, all those things. It's probably the determining factor in human relations. Thinking is important also in strategy, but in electoral situations, we're dealing with popularity, and the media can really spin that, turn it into a popularity contest and make it all about a human being named Donald Trump rather than a conceptual, intuitive thinking argument about principles and archetypes, things of that nature. So we're kind of just faced with that reality, and that's kind of the reality that we're operating in with television. They're trying to create something that does enmesh people. And I still take this opportunity also, anyone who's listening, is to go to our survey in the notes area in the main part of either our Twitter page, or I think it's also on YouTube. And if you're not familiar with the MBTI, I'd encourage people to take the survey, and especially if you're not familiar with the Enneagram, is seek out the resources that we also link to on our site.
I wanted to respond to one thing you said there, Ken, and you mentioned television a couple of times, and I encourage people to do an experiment on themselves with television and listen with the sound off and just watch the visuals. And then also turn your head away and don't look at the person, but just listen to the sound. And you'll find that experiment will put you in touch with aspects of the delivery that you're less sensitive to when you see them both together. Sometimes, especially seeing the visuals without hearing the voice that goes along with it can be really revealing.
Yeah, it's a marvelous tool, and it can be, like any tool, can be abused or can be constructive, and it has a huge effect on our culture. We've mentioned this in other podcasts, but the advent of social media, the corporate control of media, and just the sheer power of the visual auditory image itself. I don't know if humans have adapted to that yet. I don't know if they have actually realized how powerful a creator of reality this is. And in the end, the viewer is left with nothing but the sensing feeling function. And the network the producer, even movie director, would take over the intuitive and thinking role in designing a script or in sort of plotting a theme and then expressing it down at the lower level. And in the development of creatures on Earth, we start, and most of the animal kingdom does have a sensing and feeling function. Our human functions are much more developed. We really do all those things that you see in the function stack: the intuition, thinking, sensing, feeling. Everyone is capable of all of those things. It's just that we'll favor one or the other. And the fascinating part here is when we're trying to influence someone, we'll use a strategy which sometimes, like Sarah was using, the sensing, thinking, feeling chain, where you may find a reporter starting with the feeling with an expression on their face or something to sort of frame the tone, and then moving into an intuitive, and then going into a thinking, into a strategic, putting the other person on their back, on their heels, sort of with a binary question or something like that. So it's really a fascinating process, and certainly we hope we attract all political persuasions to our channel, and in the common love of psychology and history comes and goes, but some of these principles will be with us for a very long time.
Absolutely. And speaking as someone who is in the F quadrant, this idea of turning off your brain is really a very dangerous thing. And that's what I'm seeing down here, as you're talking about what happens when people watch television. I think it's really crucial for all of us to stay conscious and not let ourselves slip into these. I know I love to watch movies and see something that is moving and cry with the movie and all. It's fun. It's entertainment. That's why it's called entertainment. However, to let our opinions and our perspective on life be crafted by a director or a news producer somewhere is really not wise. And I think there are ways that we can hold ourselves in a conscious state and in a state of awareness when we are watching television or a movie, so that we don't slide into this kind of manipulation. And whether it's intentional, how you're discussing this, Ken, that the reporters and Sarah move from one point of view to another in order to, whether it's conscious or not, in order to persuade. And I think persuasion is great, but I think it's important for us to be aware when we are watching television that we are being persuaded. We're not being entertained. The entertainment's only there as a hook, as you mentioned earlier. We're constantly being persuaded by what's on the screen.
And I think there's a social reinforcement too. Humans are social creatures, and we thrive on that common feeling tone. The extroverted feeler is how it's explained in MBTI. But Don, what's the equivalent for that concept you're literate with both sides, for the extroverted feeler concept in how's that coped within Enneagram?
Well, what I'm thinking about now is not directly related to that, but to answer your question, you've got in the Enneagram your three types of the mind, will, and emotion. So the mind types are oriented around the head, and the feeling types are oriented around the heart or the emotions, and then you've got the gut types, which are oriented around kind of the sensations of the body. So it's a slightly different breakdown, but one of the things that I was looking actually for a meme, and I was hoping to be able to throw it up on the screen. Couldn't find it fast enough, but I can't help but imagine Howard Beale in the 1976 film Network saying, you people are the reality. Go out there and live life. And this television is an illusion. Don't let it become your reality. And that's what too many people have done. And in the past, people used to read books. And when you read books or even listen on the radio, you would have to engage another part of your brain to create the images. And with television, it's all done for you. So it creates this passivity that is actually really new to human development. And it is, like Cindy said, it's dangerous. It's a dangerous place to let ourselves be. Although it is, I think, if you use it right, it can be empowering. It can help you to get in touch with things you wouldn't otherwise get in touch with. As a strongly mental type myself, I tend to not be drawn to films so much for their emotion, but that does happen to me sometimes. Often, though, there'll be an intellectual hook that will draw me in. Movies like like A Beautiful Mind, or the older one, Flowers for Algernon, those were extremely moving to me because they were built around the tragic circumstances of somebody that was very mentally gifted. So that can really help you be put in touch with another aspect of your personality that you might not be activated otherwise. So there's pluses and minuses, but like Cindy said, we have to watch ourselves. We have to be aware of what we're doing with this medium.
It's funny that you mentioned Network, because I was thinking of a different character's comment in Network when the older character, who's the news producer, says, is describing his relationship with the Faye Dunaway character and how it will end. And he says something like, the peccant husband returns to jilted wife, music up, lights down, and it's over. So I think we are at our music up, lights down point in this presentation as well, unless either one of you has a parting comment that you'd like to share.
Well, I'd say just in summary, again, going back to the demographics and the realities of the politics involved, which really is based upon a decision that's made in a booth in privacy. And I don't believe any longer that type in MBTI correlates with a specific political attitude, but there are media presentations that definitely are more persuasive to how people do survey as type in MBTI. And I'm assuming, Don, how does that work with Enneagram? Do you feel there's a political correlate in any way, shape, or form?
Actually not. No. One of the surprising things about Enneagram, for anybody that's begins to investigate it a while, you and this is true for all personality typing systems, you'll have the presumption that people that are of your same type will agree with you on things, including things politics. And that actually is not the case. You will actually find your most heated disagreements with people that are of your same type. The reason being that you have come to different conclusions, but you've got your process is very similar. So that really is almost that really throws a monkey wrench into a lot of people's how they experience reality, because your expectations are not what you think they would be.
I think that definitely plays out in MBTI. The logic of the thinker does seem to have a little more commonality and a little less emotional or emotive attachment, whereas the opposite, which is kind of the points to the brilliance of the system, the opposite polarity. The feeling function has infinite variety of values. And in that regard, one feeler could get into a heated argument with another feeler. In fact, it may even exacerbate the conflict when the values differ and are not based on what we would call an objective, logical 2 + 2 is 4 kind of scenario. But this, again, the essence of humanity. In the U.S., the population, we have 60% who test as what we would call the feeler, where that function plays more of a role. And it probably, like I said earlier in the show, the human relations aspect of that function is really the factor behind affiliation, behind liking someone, loving someone. These are all not considered logical functions at all. You look at Spock as sort of in Star Trek as the epitome of the pure thinker, and it can't exist. As Jung said, the pure version of any type would be in a lunatic asylum. I think he said something to that effect. So we're definitely dealing with a balancing, and art, and it's an abstract science that we're dealing with here, but it sure is fun to be able to look at it objectively a little more than a lot of the arguing that we see going on and the bad feelings and so on in the population.
Yeah, hopefully we're giving people tools to take a step outside of your the tugs and pulls and to's and fro's of all of the different goings on in the political realm and in our society as a whole. By helping you to step out of it, you get perspective, and that's really what growing as a person is all about. So hope you find it all useful.
Well, this has been an enjoyable discussion, and hopefully our viewers have enjoyed it as well. To the curious, the seekers, and also the experts, we thank you for joining us. If you have indeed enjoyed this presentation, please click like and subscribe to our channel. We put out approximately 1 video per week and look forward to sharing with you in the future. So once again, thanks and take care.